For nearly a century, one name stood above the law in South Carolina's Low Country, and that name was Murdaugh. From 1920 to 2006, 3 generations of Murdaugh men served consecutively as solicitor for the state's 14th Judicial Circuit, building what amounted to a regional dynasty. In 5 counties, their word was law. Their reputation was gospel. Their family legacy, etched into courtrooms and backroom deals, earned the area an informal title among locals, Murdaugh Country. But their influence didn't end with a gavel. In 1910, Randolph Murdaugh Sr. founded a private legal empire that specialized in lucrative personal injury suits. It would later become known as the Parker Law Group, and by the time the 4th generation came of age, the Murdaughs were deeply embedded in both sides of the justice system, prosecuting criminals by day, suing corporations by night. Richard Alexander Alec Murdaugh was born into that privilege on May 27, 1968. Educated at the University of South Carolina, he followed in the footsteps of his forefathers, earning a law degree, joining the family firm, and volunteering as a part-time prosecutor. He married Margaret Kennedy Branstetter, better known as Maggie, and together they had 2 sons, Buster and Paul. On paper, it was a picture-perfect continuation of the Murdaugh lineage, but beneath the surface, Alec Murdaugh was living a double life. Over the course of more than a decade, Alec quietly orchestrated one of the most staggering fraud schemes in the history of American law. Millions stolen from grieving clients, embezzlement buried under layers of fake accounts, financial crimes stretching back into the late aughts, hidden in plain sight and camouflaged by a badge of Southern respectability. And that was only the beginning. By 2019, the illusion began to crack. His youngest son, Paul, had been criminally charged in the death of 19-year-old Mallory Beach after drunkenly crashing the family boat into a bridge. The accident, and the Murdaughs' apparent immunity from immediate consequence, triggered a wave of public outrage. Investigators started circling. Lawsuits piled up. The walls were closing in. Then came June 7th, 2021. At 10:07 p.m., Alec Murdaugh dialed 911 to report a double homicide. He claimed to have found his wife and son shot dead near the dog kennels on their 1,700-acre hunting estate, an isolated patch of rural Colleton County known as Moselle. Paul had been struck in the chest and head with a shotgun. Maggie had been gunned down with a high-powered rifle. It was, by every account, an execution. What followed was a year of silence from law enforcement, a tight-lipped investigation, a grieving father who insisted he was innocent, and a Southern Gothic unraveling that grew darker each passing month. By July 2022, Alec Murdaugh had been indicted for the murders of his wife and son, marking the catastrophic collapse of a century-old dynasty. And as the secrets spilled out, addiction, money laundering, insurance fraud, alleged drug trafficking, even a staged suicide attempt, it became clear this wasn't just the story of a powerful man breaking bad. This was the story of an empire built on sand, finally giving way under the weight of its own lies. This is the story of Alec Murdaugh and the end of Murdaugh Country. It's just after 10:07 p.m. when a call comes in to the Colleton County Dispatch. On the line is 53-year-old Richard Alexander Murdaugh, known simply as Alec. His voice is high, cracked, panicked, the kind of tone that's either real or rehearsed. "My wife and child was shot," he blurts out, barely coherent. The dispatcher does her best to keep him calm. "Hello," she says. "I'm still here," Alex answers.
This is Alec Murdaugh at 4147 Moselle Road. I need the police and the ambulance immediately. My wife and child have been shot badly.
He's calling from the family's sprawling hunting estate on Moselle Road in rural South Carolina. The property is massive. Over 1,700 acres of dense woodlands, fields, swamps, and trails. Alec tells dispatchers that he just returned home. Maggie, his wife, and Paul, their 22-year-old son, are both on the ground outside near the dog kennels. They're not moving. He doesn't need to check for a pulse. He already knows.
Okay, and are they breathing?
No, ma'am.
Okay, and you said it's your wife and your son?
My wife and my son.
Are they in a vehicle?
No, ma'am. They're on the ground out at my kennels.
The dispatcher gently asks if they might have shot themselves. Alex doesn't hesitate.
Okay. How did they shoot? Did they shoot themselves?
Oh, no. Hell no.
He keeps emphasizing the violence, repeating that she's got a hole in her head, and that there are no guns nearby, that he didn't shoot them. At one point, mid-sentence, when asked about the color of the house, he blurts out again, unprompted.
What color is your house on the outside?
If that's what you're asking, they didn't shoot themselves, ma'am.
What color is your house on the outside?
Alec tells dispatchers that he last spoke with Maggie about 2 hours earlier. No one else was supposed to be at the house, but as he stands outside by the kennels with their bodies, the picture he paints is messy, disjointed. He asks if he can go get a gun from the house, just in case. The dispatcher says no.
I'm going back to my house just to get a gun just in case.
Well, I know you're upset, Mr. Murdaugh, but I don't want you to get a gun and have a gun out whenever my officers get there, okay?
I will not do that.
Alex agrees, but the request alone raises eyebrows. Then, something strange slips through. When asked if there's any known reason someone might have done this, Alex says his son, Paul, had been threatened before. He's been hit several times, he says.
My son knows. My son knows.
Your son knows who was threatening him?
I have another son, ma'am.
Okay.
He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't even give a name. When pressed again, he says Paul had made reports about it, that it was on record. But if that's true, those reports were either buried deep or never found in the moment. By the time first responders arrive, Alec is on the property, gun now secured, pacing the crime scene. Maggie and Paul are both dead, and whatever really happened that night, whatever truth still exists between the blood and the grass and the cameras and the timeline, starts here, with this call. And a man crying out to the night that someone else did this. By the time the body cam starts rolling, the scenes at Moselle are still raw. It's just after 10:30 p.m. when officers arrive at the Murdaugh estate. Maggie and Paul's bodies are still lying just outside the dog kennels. Paul's head is nearly gone. Maggie's skull is open in the back. And from the start, something about it all just doesn't make sense. Alec is standing nearby when they arrive, hands visible, unarmed, cooperative. He identifies himself and confirms the victims are his wife and son, repeatedly muttering the same phrase.
It's bad. It's bad. Check the pulses.
Yes, sir. Officers immediately start locking the scene down. A shotgun is found near Alec's truck. He says he brought it with him from inside the house, just in case. It's secured, and he admits there might be a pistol in his car, but nothing's on his person. And as officers begin walking the perimeter, they start noticing what they weren't expecting to find. Shell casings, a lot of them. Spent .300 blackout rounds scattered near the bodies. That's not a shotgun. That's rifle ammunition. And both victims only appear to have one major wound each. Alec volunteers details, says Paul has been getting threats ever since the boating accident, but they never took them seriously.
This is a long story. My son was in a boat wreck a few months back. He's been getting threats. Most of it's been benign stuff we didn't take serious.
Then he adds that he's been at his parents' house. His mom has Alzheimer's, his dad was in the hospital, and he'd only just gotten back. Says he rode around with Paul earlier that afternoon.
Okay.
I rode around with Paul for 2 hours this afternoon in the pickup truck.
That's your son, Paul? Okay.
He offers, again unprompted. Officers check the scene. There's no sign of struggle, no signs of robbery, no sign of forced entry. Maggie's body has an exit wound in the back of her head, hair scattered on the ground. Paul's hands are tucked beneath his torso, like he fell face first. A pump-action shotgun is briefly suspected in Paul's case, but then it's ruled out. Shotgun wadding is found inside, but there's no matching shell nearby. Meanwhile, the .300 blackout brass is still all over the place. And that's when the confusion starts to mount. The number of casings doesn't line up with the number of visible wounds. If each victim was only shot once, why are there so many rounds? Could some of the damage in a nearby window be from buckshot? Could some of the holes in the shed, 5 or more by one officer's count, be exit wounds? Could Paul have somehow fired one of the weapons? That theory floats around for a few minutes, until it doesn't. The angle of his wound, the shell spread, the sheer brutality of the scene. None of it supports the idea of a self-inflicted shot. Meanwhile, investigators are doing what they can to secure the site before SLED arrives. Officers are told to mark their tracks, preserve tire impressions, document which units arrive and when. They're told not to re-enter the crime scene without logging it, but the conversation keeps circling back to the same problems. There are too many casings, too many questions, and not enough answers. One of Alec's law partners arrives on scene in a yellow shirt, raising some concern about too many people wandering near the evidence. Someone asks if anyone's in contact with Alec's surviving son, Buster. They want to get law enforcement to him in Colombia before the news breaks. And Alec? He's still there, visibly shaken, still cooperative, but not crying, not breaking down, just hovering, occasionally asking what he can do to help, occasionally talking about having to call Maggie's parents, but never making the call. And in the background, the case is already starting to fall apart. No motive, no witness, no obvious or real theory. Just a powerful name, a long shadow, and a crime scene that refuses to make sense. After a few more procedural questions, ages, dates of birth, the usual, the interview shifts. The officers ask if there'd been any trouble on the property, break-ins, trespassers, anything unusual. And that's when Alec changes gears. He doesn't hesitate. He pivots straight to the 2019 boat crash.
Have y'all been having any problems out here? Trespassers,
None
people
that,
breaking in?
none that I know of. The only thing that what comes to my mind is my son Paul was in a boat wreck a couple years ago, and there's been he was charged with being arrested for being the driver. There's been a lot of negative publicity about that, and there's been a lot of people online just really vile stuff. But when Paul's out and about, I mean, people routinely, I don't think I know the full story, because I don't think they give it to me, but I mean, He's been punched and hit and just attacked a lot. So, but I mean, nothing like this.
Yeah. Any one person in particular or group of people
I don't know.
that you could think of?
Not that I know, no, sir.
He also says the family didn't take it seriously at the time, but now looking back, maybe they should have. He uses words like punched and attacked, making it sound like Paul had been living under constant siege. He repeats that there were threats all the time, but when asked for specifics, he admits he never actually saw any. Paul supposedly just told him about it. Vague enough to sound plausible, ominous enough to suggest motive. Alec keeps it at arm's length, not too specific, not too helpful, but just dangerous enough to sound credible. Then he starts rattling off names. Will Chapman, Will Loving, Bobby Boyle, people Paul spent time with, people investigators can call, people who can widen the web and take the pressure off of him. He says Paul was planning to move in with a few of them, that he was a normal kid with a good life, something to protect and something to lose. Then comes the truth, the most bizarre detour in the entire interview. Alec lowers his voice and says,
I mean, this is such a stupid thing. I'm even embarrassed to say it.
He introduces a man named C.B. Rowe, a guy he says worked for him, wasn't doing a great job,
He wasn't cutting the mustard, but I hadn't told him this yet.
but hadn't been fired yet. Then Alec tells a story that, by all accounts, sounds like pure fiction. According to Alec, Rowe once told Paul he'd been recruited in high school by an FBI team and Navy SEALs to hunt and kill radical Black Panthers between Myrtle Beach and Savannah, Georgia. That was his assignment, assassination, supposedly, at age 16. Alec says he doesn't think Rowe is the killer, but only after repeating the entire story. It's a classic tactic. Plant the seed and back off. Let the story hang in the air. He even admits it's kind of a far-fetched story, but it's already out there. He doesn't need to believe it. He just needs them to. He throws out a few details to anchor the fiction. Says Rowe had the day off to take his dad to the doctor. Says they spoke briefly on the phone while he, Alec, was headed to see his mom. He adds that he was on the phone with Chris Wilson too, his longtime friend and colleague. It's an alibi wrapped in a distraction. 2 calls, 2 alibis, neatly packaged. When asked how Rowe seemed during the call, Alex says normal, no red flags, but he still hands over the guy's phone number and address just in case. Just enough to keep Rowe in the mix. He finishes the anecdote by saying Rowe and Paul got along fine.
That's just really, really weird.
He adds, like an afterthought. But it's not an afterthought. It's intentional. It's the breadcrumb he wants them to follow. It's been less than 10 minutes, yet Alec builds a world full of shadows. Internet trolls, public threats, possible enemies, maybe even government-trained assassins. He's weaving in fact, fiction, and speculation, giving just enough of each to keep the investigators off balance. The boat crash? Real. The anger? Probably. The threats? Unconfirmed. And the FBI Navy SEAL fantasy? Wild. But he says it all the same. Before long, investigators circle back to Alec's earlier story, the one about C.B. Rowe and the bizarre assassin fantasy. Alec repeats that he doesn't think Rowe was involved, but doubles down anyway. He says Paul was so disturbed by the man's ramblings that he secretly recorded parts of the conversation. Now, not only is Rowe's delusion being repeated, it's being framed as a source of fear, something Paul felt strongly enough about to document. It's a calculated move by Alec for sure, meant to elevate Rowe from eccentric employee to potential threat, without having to actually point a finger. He says Rowe had worked for the family for about 2 months. Then, right on cue, the topic turns back to the 2019 boat crash. An investigator asks point blank, "Did anyone from the crash have a real grudge?" Alex softens his answer. He says there's been some yap, some tension, but mostly from Paul people didn't even know. It's again a subtle deflection, acknowledging friction without giving it weight. He offers an example. Paul came home from Charleston one day with a black eye. Wouldn't say what happened. Couldn't fight back because of the charges hanging over his head. Just had to take it. Alec pauses, then says,
I've never been prouder of him than the way he has handled the pressures and the adversity in that situation.
It's overly sentimental, seemingly rehearsed, again. He calls Paul a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful kid who, quote,
can do almost anything, he gets along with almost anybody.
It's not just grief, it's a eulogy with a motive baked in. The message is clear. Paul was a target. He was loved. He didn't deserve this. So maybe someone out there made it happen. Then the questions shift to guns. Investigators ask about firearms on the property, and Alec hedges. He says they're not officially stored there, but yeah, there are usually guns around. A 12-gauge shotgun maybe. He can't say for sure. He thinks it was a camo Benelli or Beretta, something like that. It's a vague answer about a very specific question, and that vagueness becomes important later. Because the type of weapon, and whether it's missing, is a key part of what starts unraveling Alec's version of events. The lead investigator gets to the point. The shotgun Alec had when deputies arrived, where did it come from? Alec admits he went inside and got it after he called 911. Says he was scared, probably overreacting. He quickly adds that he told the dispatcher he was going to do it. It's a rehearsed response, a legal patch job for what could easily be seen as tampering or preparation. In the way he tells it, calm, cooperative, like a man with nothing to hide. He says the family owns 20 to 25 guns, rifles, pistols, shotguns, all supposedly kept in a hunting room at the main house. That number, 25, is designed to make missing firearms harder to track. If there are that many floating around, then who's to say what's there and what's not? The conversation eventually circles back to the day itself. Alex says Paul had been working for his brother, came home early, and the two of them spent the afternoon riding around the property. Just the two of them, checking on sunflower fields. It's an image of normalcy, father and son in the truck, laughing in the sun, not a hint of tension. It's also another piece of timeline planting. As the interview continues, Alec walks the investigators through the lead up to that night in a tone that's both chatty and curiously imprecise. He says Maggie had been in Charleston earlier that day for a doctor's appointment. He can't quite remember what for. Something about her stomach and maybe her tooth? The doctor's name? He thinks it was this or that, but he's not sure. It's a pattern that repeats itself in these interviews. When a detail might eventually matter, Alec leans into vagueness. When it's about Paul planting sunflower seeds or who owns what gun, he's oddly specific. He says Maggie got home fairly late, though he doesn't know if it was dark yet. Paul, on the other hand, had already been home early, well before dinner. The goal here is to anchor the timeline to something casual and routine. When the officers ask if it's normal for Maggie to be down at the kennels, Alec doesn't miss a beat.
Was it unusual for Maggie to feed the dogs this time of night or check on them?
Oh no, I mean she played with those dogs all the time. And it's especially common for her to, she's been gone for a while, to come and let especially two of them out to run.
He wants her presence down there to feel expected, natural, not like someone was lured. Then comes the question about cameras. Are there any on the property? Alex says no, not up by the house or kennels. Just a few deer cams pointed at hunting stands. In other words, no footage exists of who came or went that night. At least, Not until Paul's phone video would later flip that story on its head. Before we get there, though, as the conversation drifts back to the timeline, Alec begins to shape the kind of day he wants investigators to believe he had. He says he was home most of the time. Paul got back early, they, quote, messed around, rode around the property, checked on some things. Then Alec went inside, laid on the couch, and took a nap for 25 to 30 minutes. The details feel spontaneous, but they're not. Every single line is meant to be mundane, harmless, normal. When he woke up, he said, he tried to call Maggie, but she didn't answer. That was odd, he says. She's usually pretty good about picking up, but not odd enough to worry, at least not yet. He says she'd mentioned she might come with him to visit his mother, but it wasn't typical, so he went alone. Another piece of the story, the caring son, off to check on his sick mother while his wife stayed behind to tend to the dogs. Then, Alec references the calls and texts, each one placed after the murders had already happened, though he presents them as genuine attempts to check in. He texted Maggie at 9:08 p.m. Going to check on him, be right back. He says he called around 9:45, texted again at 9:47. And by 10:06, he was on the phone with 911, reporting their deaths. He even throws in that he tried calling Paul too. It's all part of the theater, creating a sequence of actions that, in retrospect, were all part of the cover. At the time, it read like a concern, but now it reads like control. One of the officers mentions they'll probably have more questions later. Alec nods. Of course, anything to help. He's cooperative, composed, and still in costume. The grieving husband, the stunned father, the man caught in a nightmare supposedly not of his making. As the interview winds down, the tone softens, but the performance doesn't. The questions start to feel more logistical than investigative. Alternate contact numbers, relatives to inform. But for Alec Murdaugh, each one is another chance to keep the mask on. When asked for another number in case his cell phone dies, Alec doesn't hesitate. He offers up Randy and John Marvin, his brothers. No landline, but he's surrounded by family. He wants the investigators to see that, see him as part of a tight-knit, supportive circle. A man with nothing to hide, and a man being held up by his people. He's then asked about his father, who was in the hospital that night. Alec answers in vague platitudes.
And you said your dad's in the hospital?
Yes, sir.
Which hospital? Charleston or?
Savannah, Candler, St. Joseph's.
Is he doing okay, or what's?
He's having a really, really hard time. He's got a lot going on.
Okay.
You know, he's doing okay given everything, but he's got a lot going on.
It's deliberately hazy, just enough to elicit sympathy, just enough to remind them how much weight he's supposedly carrying. His wife and son are dead. His father is sick. His mother has Alzheimer's, and he's drowning in tragedy. When the conversation turns to Maggie's parents, Alec leans into that role again. He says they're elderly, that her mother just had knee surgery. He adds that his brother called Maggie's sister's husband Bart to deliver the news in person.
Have you been in touch with them tonight?
Contacted, yes. I had my brother call Bart, the wife of his sister, the husband of Maggie's sister, so that they could go and tell Maggie's parents. I felt like they needed to hear it in person, and they are going there and calling me.
Then comes the mention of Buster. Alec confirms he has one other child, a 24-year-old son named Richard Alexander Jr., who they call Buster. He says Buster is on his way to the property. What he doesn't say is that Buster is now the last immediately family member alive, and Alec knows it. Investigators circle back to the crime scene. They ask if Paul had been moved, if Alec tried to flip him over. He says yes, that he tried, that he checked, that he already knew, but had to check anyway. It's a scripted grief beat. Just enough denial, just enough heartbreak to seem real. But what stands out, now that we've seen the footage, is how clean he was. No blood, no stains, not even on his hands. The disconnect between his words and his physical state couldn't be more stark. Asked if it was routine for Paul to be out there, Alec doesn't miss a beat.
And did he help Maggie a lot out here with the animals?
He helped everybody with everything.
Okay, so it was kind of routine for him to be out here as well in the evening?
This place is his absolute passion.
Okay.
The words are again almost too perfect. It's another line that hits different now. One more layer of emotional varnish slapped over the bare facts. He's doing everything he can to make Paul's presence at the kennels feel normal, inevitable, routine. Then they ask about the path he took from the house to the scene and back. He confirms, yes, he came from the house, walked to the kennels, and returned the same way to get a shotgun. This is Alec reinforcing his story brick by brick, laying down the route just the way he wants it to be remembered. And as the interview finally wraps up, the coroner is mentioned, the autopsies. There's a quiet moment where Alec turns and says,
No, don't let him come up here.
He's referring to Buster. He doesn't want him walking into what he knows is a bloodbath. And the line lands like a crack in the veneer. For a man pretending to be powerless, Alec is still controlling the room, still calling the shots, still managing the scene. He finishes the interview with a flurry of thank yous. He's polite, appreciative. He tells the officers he's grateful for, quote, everything y'all are doing. It sounds like teamwork, like shared grief. But we know now he was lying the entire time. And the viewers saw it too. They noticed the inconsistencies, the way he described touching Paul, flipping him over, checking pulses, but somehow walked away completely clean. They pointed out the lack of tears, the calm demeanor, the way he recited events like a checklist. No shock, no panic, no real fear. They noticed the glaring absence of concern for Buster. If your family's just been slaughtered, your first instinct is to protect what's left. But Alec never asks if Buster's safe, never seems worried that whoever did this might come for him next. Because he knows no one else is coming. Because the threat isn't actually out there. And the final verdict from the viewers? This wasn't a man in mourning. It was a man putting on a show. Every anecdote rehearsed, every line carefully placed. The small talk, the water bottle, the offhand details about Maggie's mom or Paul's friends. All of it part of a performance. And when the curtain came down, and the police finally saw through the act, the audience already had. In the previous interrogation, Alec told investigators he was with his mother at the time of the murders. Says he left the house, went over to check on her, and came back to find Maggie and Paul dead. It sounds plausible. Quiet, mundane, ordinary. He even throws in a nap. But as it turns out, the truth was sitting in his own son's pocket. At 8:40 p.m. on June 7, 2021, just minutes before Paul and Maggie were killed, Paul recorded a 58-second Snapchat video at the dog kennels. It's a simple clip. Paul's checking on a friend's dog, filming the tail end of the animal's ear injury. But in the background, there are voices, not muffled and not distant, clear. And one of them is Alec Murdaugh.
Get back! Get back! Quit, Cash. Come on. Quit. It's okay. Come here. It's not bad. Come here, Cash. Shit. Come here. Post it. Cash.
Hey, he's got a bird in his mouth.
Hey, Bubba. This is a chicken. Come here, Cash. Cash, quit.
This single video blows a massive hole through Alec's story. He had insisted he wasn't at the kennels that night, said he was back at the house, alone, sleeping on the couch. Said he didn't even know Maggie and Paul were there until he found them dead. But Paul's phone tells a different story, because there's no mistaking it. Alec was there, and he was there right before the murders. Rogan Gibson, one of Paul's closest friends, had been talking to him around the same time. He was on the phone with Paul as he walked through the kennels. Rogan later testified that he heard 3 voices: Paul, Maggie, and Alec. Not maybe, not probably. He says it was them. All of them together, alive. In the courtroom, when asked to identify the voice in the video, Rogan didn't hesitate. He pointed directly at Alec Murdaugh. And it gets worse. A cell phone expert brought in during the investigation testified that several of Alec's call logs were missing, specifically from the time period leading up to the murders, as if something had been wiped, something critical, something that didn't fit the story he wanted to tell. So now, the alibi, already thin, starts to unravel completely. Because the man who claimed to have been miles away, asleep on the couch, was actually standing right next to the people who would be dead minutes later, captured in his son's final recording. A voice from the shadows, caught by the one person who didn't survive long enough to testify. Paul never made it out of those kennels, but his phone did. In a stroke of good luck rarely posed by modern technology, the phone remembered. It stored the data, and it held the key that would bust the entire investigation wide open. But the Snapchat video was only the first step in spotlighting Alec Murdaugh's bizarre and brazenly fake behavior. A few months after his wife and son were murdered in cold blood, long before the Snapchat surfaced, where the heat was truly on, the lawyer-turned-killer drummed up maybe the most obvious act of guilt one could muster. If someone were to write a book on how not to appear like the most suspicious person alive, the optics of bunking a half-assed assisted suicide attempt would be the opening chapter. In September 2021, just 3 months after Maggie and Paul were murdered, Alec Murdaugh ended up in the headlines again, this time as a victim. At least, that's how he explained it. Surely everyone will believe him a second time, right? On the afternoon of September 4th, Alec called 911 from the side of a rural road in Hampton County, South Carolina. He said he'd been shot in the head while changing a tire. Claimed it was a random drive-by, an ambush. He was airlifted to the hospital and treated for what officials called a superficial gunshot wound. But as usual with Alec, the story didn't hold. Within days, the full picture started to come into focus. On September 13th, Alec confessed to police that the shooting wasn't random. It wasn't a mugging, wasn't an ambush. It was a setup. He had hired someone, Curtis Edward Smith, his former client and, according to authorities, a longtime drug connection, to shoot him. The goal? To make it look like a murder so that Buster, his only surviving son, could collect a $10 million life insurance payout. Both men were arrested. Smith was charged with assisted suicide, assault, conspiracy, firearms violations, and insurance fraud. Alec was hit with insurance fraud and conspiracy as well. Just the beginning of what would become an avalanche of legal problems. The failed suicide attempt came just one day after Alec had been forced out of his family's prestigious law firm, PMPED. He was accused of stealing millions of dollars from clients. His career was in freefall. His reputation was gone. And at least according to him, this botched execution for hire was supposed to be his exit strategy. From jail, Alec began calling family. The recorded conversations revealed just how far things had unraveled. In one call with his sister-in-law, Liz, he described the shooting in detail, saying the bullet had entered and exited his skull, left him with a brain bleed and bruising, but caused no permanent damage. He said the blast knocked him off his feet, that he temporarily lost vision, but that he never, quote, saw the light, or had any kind of near-death experience.
I mean, do you feel like you were near death and that you were seeing the light?
No. No, it wasn't that bad. It just, I guess it was the impact. I mean, I wasn't seeing light. I was seeing dark. You know, I mean, the first thing I thought was...
You have 1 minute remaining.
And then I'm like, I know I'm not dead, because, you know, I remember touching my head, and I remember thinking the back of my head's blown off and I'm going to be blind. And then, you know, it slowly started coming back. I could stand up because it knocked me down.
Mm-hmm.
And then I could stand up. I knew I was standing up. And, you know, then I think I kind of went to one knee. And, you know, I couldn't see, and I was trying to. It didn't take long at all before it started improving. You know, I mean, like it didn't get where I could totally see, but I could start seeing.
Your time is up.
What stood out in the calls wasn't just the injury, it was the confusion. Alec was disoriented, emotional, and unsure of who in his family knew what. He sounded like a man untethered. At one point, he admitted he was detoxing from opioids at the time of the shooting, that he was in withdrawal, that maybe his memory of events wasn't totally reliable. But the facts were clear enough. Alec had tried to orchestrate his own death, not out of guilt, not for redemption, but as one more scheme in a life built on fraud. A staged suicide, hired out to a local drug dealer, to salvage what little he had left, and to leave Buster with something more than a legacy of shame. It all seemed a little too on the nose at that point. By October 2021, the quiet part was over. SLED confirmed what many had suspected for months. Alec Murdaugh was officially a person of interest in the murders of his wife and son. It was the first formal indication that the investigation had turned inward, and that the man at the center of the storm wasn't just a grieving husband. He was now the primary focus. From the beginning, the defense worked hard to discredit the process. They pointed to a series of early missteps. The crime scene had been exposed to rain before it could be fully secured. Law enforcement allowed friends and family to walk through the area. Certain pieces of evidence, they claimed, were never collected at all. But behind the scenes, SLED continued building a case. Quietly, but methodically. They brought in specialists from across the state, forensic analysts, pathologists, crime scene experts, and digital investigators who sifted through cell phone records and GPS telemetry. Then, in July 2022, the dam broke. A grand jury in Colleton County indicted Alec Murdaugh on 4 charges: 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. He pleaded not guilty, but prosecutors announced they would seek life in prison without the possibility of parole, not the death penalty. It was a historic moment in South Carolina legal history. One of the state's most powerful legal dynasties facing the justice system it had once helped control. And now, Alec Murdaugh was no longer just a person of interest. Alec Murdaugh was the accused. County Courthouse in Walterboro, South Carolina. The courtroom was filled with the kind of Southern decorum and pressure you only find when the defendant's last name used to mean power. Judge Clifton Newman presided, Chief Prosecutor Creighton Waters led the state's case, joined by John Metters. The defense was handled by longtime Murdaugh allies Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin. The defense moved early to block testimony related to Alec's financial crimes, arguing it was irrelevant to the murder charges. But Judge Newman disagreed. On February 6th, he ruled that the evidence of Alec's ongoing theft and fraud, millions of dollars siphoned from clients and his own law firm, was admissible. The motive, prosecutors say, wasn't just about money. It was about exposure. The financial empire was crumbling. The walls were closing in. The courtroom wasn't without its drama. A bomb threat on February 8th halted proceedings. On February 13th, 2 jurors were dismissed and replaced due to COVID. Another juror would later be removed for misconduct just 1 day before the verdict. And on February 24th, a new charge was added after Alec was accused of passing contraband in the courtroom. Still, the prosecution kept moving. They called the first responders from the scene. They played Paul's final Snapchat. Firearms and ballistics experts testified, as did analysts who pulled phone records and car telemetry data. Maggie's phone activity was dissected. Friends of Paul described their last interactions. A timeline expert helped pin down the evening minute by minute. And in a devastating moment for the defense, prosecutors played the full June 21st interview, where Alec wept and said,
"Sitting here talking today is tough.
It's just so bad. I did it so bad."
By February 17th, the state rested. The defense tried to redirect the narrative. Buster Murdaugh testified on behalf of his father, saying he believed in Alec's innocence and had been over 200 miles away in Rock Hill at the time of the murders. A crime scene engineer tried to argue that the shooter's height didn't match the height of Alec. Other experts criticized the way the scene had been handled. Then came the main event. Alec Murdaugh took the stand on February 23rd. Over 2 days, he denied killing Maggie and Paul, but admitted he had lied about his whereabouts, about his alibi, about nearly everything. He blamed it all on opioid addiction, saying it caused paranoid thinking. He admitted to stealing from clients, lying to partners, and hiring someone to shoot him on the side of the road. But through it all, he maintained he did not pull the trigger. On February 27th, the defense rested. The motion for a directed verdict was denied. The prosecution returned briefly for rebuttal on February 28th, calling back previous witnesses and a police chief who knew Alec personally. Closing arguments began March 1st. The next day, another juror was dismissed for discussing the case outside the courtroom, replaced by an alternate. By that afternoon, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty. 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. Time of deliberation? Less than 3 hours. The answer was obvious. On March 3rd, Alec Murdaugh was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Judge Newman denied all motions for mistrial. The evidence, he said, was overwhelming.
Mr. Murdaugh, I sentence you to the State Department of Corrections on each of the murder indictments in the murder of your wife, Maggie Murdaugh. I sentence you for the term of the rest of your natural life for the murder of Paul Murdaugh, whom you probably loved so much. I sentence you to prison for murdering him for the rest of your natural life. Those sentences will run consecutive. Under the statute involving possession of a weapon during a violent crime, there is no sentence where a life sentence is imposed on other indictments. That is the sentence of the court, and you are remanded to the State Department of Corrections. and officers may carry forth on the imposition.
Murdaugh was then transferred to Kirkland Correctional for evaluation. The aftermath of Alec Murdaugh's conviction didn't mark the end of the legal saga. If anything, it cracked open a second act that's still unfolding in courtrooms and headlines. Within days of his sentencing, Murdaugh's defense team announced plans to appeal. A formal notice was filed on March 9, 2023, and just 2 weeks later, on March 23rd, the remnants of his former life, furniture and hunting gear, even personalized monogrammed goods, were auctioned off to the public, symbolic and literal dismantling of the Murdaugh estate. But the money problems that loomed over the case didn't vanish with the murder conviction. On May 24, 2023, Alec was federally indicted on 22 counts of financial crimes: wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. Then, in November, he pleaded guilty to every state charge related to his fraud schemes. On November 29th, he was sentenced to 27 years in state prison. 5 months later, the federal gavel dropped again, 40 years, concurrent with his existing sentence, and in order to repay $8.7 million in restitution. Life behind bars, with stacked decades and plenty of payments in front of it. But the real chaos came not from the courtroom, but from the jury box. On September 5, 2023, Murdaugh's attorneys filed a motion accusing Colleton County Clerk of Court Rebecca Becky Hill of jury tampering. They claimed she'd improperly influenced jurors, encouraged premature deliberation, and talked about the case in ways that breached impartiality. Just days before that, Becky Hill had published a book about the trial, raising immediate concerns about self-interest and ethical violations. Hill quickly hired her own attorneys. On October 17th, the South Carolina Court of Appeals paused Murdaugh's appeal so the allegations could be investigated. Judge Clifton Newman recused himself, and former South Carolina Supreme Court Justice Jean Toll took over. On January 29, 2024, Toll denied the motion for a new trial, stating that while Hill's behavior may have been inappropriate, it didn't meet the threshold to overturn a verdict. Less than 2 months later, Becky Hill resigned, but the legal clouds didn't lift. In August 2024, the South Carolina Supreme Court agreed to review the case, and by December, the defense had filed a 132-page appeal, reigniting the battle for a retrial. Then, in a final twist that cast everything in a harsher light, on May 14, 2025, Hill was criminally charged. 3 felonies, including misconduct and perjury, following an independent SLED investigation. The woman who presided over the jury process now faces charges of her own. And yet, the central facts remain unchanged. On June 7, 2021, Alec Murdaugh murdered his wife Maggie and his son Paul. Prosecutors argue the motive was rooted in greed and desperation. The very morning of the murders, a colleague confronted him about $792,000 that had gone missing from the firm's books. Murdaugh was also facing a looming hearing in the civil case tied to the 2019 boat crash that killed Mallory Beach. That court appearance was set for June 10th, just 3 days after Maggie and Paul were found dead. Behind the facade of tradition and generational wealth, Murdaugh's life had been quietly imploding. His crimes were on the verge of being exposed. But after the murders, the scrutiny shifted. For a moment, the financial pressure eased. He bought himself time, but not enough. Because at the time Alec Murdaugh stood trial for double homicide, there were already footprints in the sand. Years of quiet, suspicious deaths, all now circling back to the same family. The Murdaugh name wasn't just associated with power and legacy. It had become a common thread, running through some of the Low Country's darkest and most unresolved tragedies. The first name that reemerged was Stephen Smith. In 2015, Stephen, a 19-year-old nursing student who was openly gay, was found dead in the middle of a rural road in Hampton County. His head had been crushed by blunt force trauma, but from the very beginning, the investigation was off. No broken glass, no skid marks, no vehicle debris. Yet the death was ruled a hit and run, and no suspects were charged. Stephen had been a classmate of Buster Murdaugh, and almost immediately, rumors spread that the two had a secret relationship, one that may have provoked a violent response. Multiple sources told authorities about these rumors, and just like that, the Murdaugh family name began to float in the background of another unsolved death. Buster has denied any involvement. He's called the rumors baseless and claimed he was at the family's beach house in Edisto with his mother and Paul on the night Stephen died. Both of them are now dead. In June 2021, while investigating the murders of Maggie and Paul, SLED reopened the Smith case. Less than 2 years later, they officially declared Stephen's death a homicide. But as of May 2025, there have been no arrests and the case remains unsolved. Then there was Gloria Satterfield. In 2018, Gloria had worked as the Murdaugh's housekeeper for over 2 decades. According to the family, she tripped over the dogs and fell down the brick stairs at Moselle. She was hospitalized, suffered a stroke, and died on February 26th. But no autopsy was performed. Her death certificate listed natural causes, a designation the county coroner would later testify was completely inappropriate. And what followed wasn't just irregular, it was criminal. Alec Murdaugh told Gloria's sons he'd help them recover money through a wrongful death claim. He helped arrange a $4.3 million settlement, and then kept it for himself. Through a tangle of shell accounts, and with the help of his lawyer friend Corey Fleming and banker Chad Westendorf, every dollar was rerouted away from Gloria's family and into Alec's pocket. Investigators reopened that case in September 2021. In June 2022, Gloria's body was exhumed. In August 23, Corey Fleming pleaded guilty to 23 counts, including fraud and money laundering. He was sentenced to nearly 14 years in prison. Alec later pleaded guilty too, and received 27 years for his financial crimes, including this one. Gloria's family has since recovered over $6.5 million. The banker, Westendorf, was never charged, but his bank's CEO was quietly forced out. And then, there was the crash that shattered everything. In 2019, 19-year-old Mallory Beach was thrown from a boat piloted by a drunken underage Paul Murdaugh. His blood alcohol content was 0.286, more than 3 times the legal limit for an adult. He was never arrested at the scene. He wasn't restrained. He wasn't even tested right away. Witnesses described Paul as belligerent, aggressive, and completely out of control before the crash. But the police response was sluggish and defensive, as if the Murdaugh name still had gravity, even then. Paul was eventually charged with 3 felonies, but before he could stand trial, he was murdered. The connection didn't stop there. Buster had allegedly given Paul his ID, similar height, similar face, so he could buy the alcohol used that night. In January 23, Buster reached a settlement with Mallory's family and the 3 other passengers on the boat. The Beach family filed a wrongful death suit anyway. Another family, the Cooks, sued Alec, alleging he coerced them into hiring Corey Fleming to shield Paul from liability. But more than any individual lawsuit, it was this crash that turned up the heat. Public scrutiny over how Paul was treated after the wreck led directly to calls for Alec's financial records. What those records revealed pulled the last thread on a dynasty already unraveling like a spool of yarn, and what started as one brutal night on the water became the catalyst that cracked the entire legacy wide open. It wasn't just the random deaths, though. There were plenty of other Murdaugh family crimes that painted a portrait not of a broken man, but of someone who spent more than a decade methodically bleeding his community dry. Remember the so-called roadside shooting in September of 2021, when Alec claimed he was ambushed on the back road in Hampton County and shot in the head while changing a tire? That story also unraveled almost immediately. His injuries weren't superficial. He was treated and released. And then came the confession that it wasn't an attack. It was a setup. That bizarre plot would have been shocking enough on its own, but it was just the surface of much deeper rot. Between 2009 and 2021, Alec Murdaugh stole millions, anywhere between 8 and 20 million US dollars, from over 30 clients, maybe more. Wrongful death settlements, personal injury awards, estate payments, money meant for victims and grieving families was siphoned into Murdaugh's private accounts. The Satterfield family, the Pinckneys, the Taylors, the Grays, family names that never made national headlines, but who were all gutted just the same. In one of the most disturbing examples, Murdaugh is accused of stealing nearly $1 million from the estate of Hakeem Pinckney, a young man who was paralyzed after a car accident. Hakeem died after his ventilator was allegedly unplugged in a care facility. Murdaugh represented the family and proceeded to rob them. Along the way, he didn't work alone. Russell Laffitte, the CEO of Palmetto State Bank, allegedly helped Murdaugh funnel the stolen money through fake conservatorships. Laffitte was later fired and criminally charged. It wasn't just money either. Between 2013 and 2021, Murdaugh and Curtis Smith allegedly ran a full-scale drug-dealing operation. Prosecutors say Alec used $2.4 million in stolen funds to buy and move narcotics across several South Carolina counties. Hundreds upon hundreds of transactions, hidden in plain sight. In June 2022, both were indicted on money laundering and drug distribution charges. And then came Lindsay Edwards. In 2022, Edwards, an alleged former sex worker, came forward with horrific claims. She said she was repeatedly assaulted and raped by Murdaugh at drug-fueled sex parties, that she was trafficked by a local madman and forced into contact with him despite repeated violence. SLED opened an investigation, but as of now, no charges have been filed. But the story is still unfolding. Meanwhile, the lawsuits kept coming. In September 2022, Forge Consulting sued Murdaugh after discovering he had set up a fake bank account using their name. He'd used the forged account to route stolen settlement funds into his own pocket yet again. Then, in October, a man named Manuel Santos Cristiani from Mexico filed suit, alleging he too was defrauded by a Murdaugh-led company involving lawyers, bankers, and the PMPED family firm. In December 2022, Alec was charged with 9 counts of state tax evasion. Authorities say he failed to report nearly $500,000 in income. Again, money stolen from clients. By then, the full scale of his criminal enterprise finally come into view. He was convicted of murdering his wife and son in March 2023. That November, he was sentenced to 27 years on financial charges. By April of 24, federal prosecutors had handed down a 40-year sentence for money laundering, wire fraud, and bank fraud. The sentence ran concurrent with his state time, and he was ordered to pay almost $9 million in restitution. That was the final nail. Behind the scenes, Buster Murdaugh was given power of attorney in 2021. Just weeks after the roadside shooting, he began selling off assets. Moselle, rebranded Cross Swamp Farm, was listed for $3.9 million on the market. But a judge soon froze everything. A court-appointed receivership was established to manage the assets and prevent further concealment. Alec was arrested in October 2021 after completing rehab and placed in custody. His time behind bars has not been quiet. At Alvin S. Glenn Detention Center, he was involved in a violent altercation with an inmate named Robert Drayton, who had allegedly raped Alec's niece. After sentencing, he was transferred to Kirkland Correctional. As of May 2025, Alec Murdaugh has been indicted on 102 separate criminal charges. He has been disbarred, stripped of his wealth, and imprisoned for the rest of his life. The fraud ran for over a decade. The murders, according to prosecutors, were a desperate bid to stall the collapse. And yet, the collapse came anyway. Now, there's no legacy left, just the wreckage of power abused and justice delayed. May the memories, Alec Murdaugh's victims, and the victims of the Murdaugh family empire in general live on forever.